instead in a small Zoom boxes. In London, we often had the chance to meet and talk about the current developments in Cyprus, but we haven't been able to do so since 2017. Of course, there has been a lot of developments in the island since then, and though none are favorable for solution, I believe. Our audience here are perfectly aware that the Cyprus dispute has been on the international community's agenda for more than 60 years, but it still awaits a solution. The issue has affected both the Turkish and Greek people's wealth, life quality, hopes, and more importantly, caused many to lose their lives as well. Additionally, for both communities, it has caused years of uncertainty and concerns for the future. As a UN initiative supported by the EU, the famous Annan Plan was the closest the two communities came to find a solution. However, the plan did not pass the referendum on the Greek side, thus questioning any hope for a solution at the time. However, although the rejection of the Annan Plan by the Greek Cypriots caused great disappointment for the Turks, and although the Greek Cypriots gained a disproportionate advantage over the Turks due to their EU membership. Contrary to what was thought, the solution efforts continued since then, until Crans-Montana in 2017. Since the dispute has turned into an international problem, any settlement seems to need additional approval from the international community as well, especially from the US for sure and the EU, in order to be lasting. The international community for long suggested federation as a solution for Cyprus, and they stand firm on this idea. International organizations that are directly involved in the issue, such as the EU and UN, also officially support a federal state in Cyprus. Furthermore, the genuine owners of the island, namely the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots leaders, had also backed the federation concept since 1977 and 79 summit agreements. However, even though all parties in Cyprus seemed to compromise on federalism, they were never able to agree on its form. Their understanding of federalism is completely different from each other. Roughly, the Greek federal plan was closer to a unitary state, while the Turkish Cypriots demanded a more decentralized confederal-like state. As a matter of fact, 7 UN Secretary Generals, 25 Secretary Generals, Cyprus Special Advisors worked for the solution till now. Among US special envoys, there were names like Richard Holbrooke, who had successfully brokered a peace agreement in Bosnia that led the signing of the famous Dayton Peace Accords in 1995. But it didn't work in Cyprus. Therefore, Cyprus, being named as the mediator's graveyard, is not without reason, actually. Besides that, hundreds of meetings were held between all kinds of representatives or leaders in Cyprus, from politicians to soldiers, from businessmen to clergy. And these leaders met at their own homes, sometimes on the Green Line, sometimes in indirect negotiations through intermediaries, sometimes directly in luxury hotel rooms in Switzerland, for instance, or in the UN headquarters in New York, in the working breakfasts, in cafes, and sometimes with their wives as well, but none of these efforts have brought a solution till now. However, after the collapse of Crans-Montana, Turkey declared that it was not meaningful anymore to continue with the UN parameters, the ones that we know very well. Even the former President Akıncı said, "I have devoted my life to federation, but at this point, common mind should be sought for different formulas." And he brought the two states solution to the agenda. And the new president, Ersin Tatar, announced clearly in accordance with Turkey as well, that he was going to defend this time not a federation, but instead a two-state formula. Since advocating a two-state solution would invalidate most of the past negotiations for a federal administration, it can be said that a different negotiation process will take place this time, possibly. But on the other hand, it should be noted that Greek side has definitely declared that it will refuse any kind of two-states formula. Probably next month, the parties will meet once again at the unofficial five-party conference under the auspices of the UN. So the negotiations are starting once more. Indeed, I'm not very much hopeful about the possible outcomes of this future new negotiation series. However, I know that you are more optimist, as can be understood from the title you have chosen for your webinar today, Why a Settlement is Still Possible, you ask. So we are looking forward to hearing your views on that. So I would like to leave the stage to you now because our audience is eager and looking forward to listening to you. But before that, I would like to take you once more for sparing your valuable time for our students and colleagues here as well. It's a great pleasure for us to host such an important name here, and we feel very lucky that you are here. So the ground is yours.
Altuğ, thank you so much for such a warm welcome, and yes, it's a great shame that I can't be with you. And you know, I was thinking back just actually yesterday. I was thinking back to many of the lovely conversations that we've had over the years about Cyprus, and you know, just the way things are going, and hopes, concerns about the situation. So, you know, it's a great honor to be asked to speak to you all. And Enes, thank you very much for the very warm introduction and CV. Yes, it sort of sometimes feels a bit strange to sort of look back on all those things. Look, I am an optimist on Cyprus, but like everyone else who works on Cyprus, I have good days and I have bad days. I have good hours and I have bad hours. It can literally change as quickly as that. And I've tried to understand what it is that would make me feel positive about a situation or negative. And I don't know, it's almost like a gut feeling. For anyone who doesn't know, I mean, I've worked on Cyprus now, and I take a deep breath when I say it, for 30 years. I first went to the island when I was 18 years old in the summer of 1990, and my late father had a business out there, and the family moved out there, and it was the start of a relationship between me and the island, which has continued now for 3 decades. And so at the same time as I've got a very strong professional interest in the Cyprus problem, I've also got an extremely close personal interest. I still have family living on the island. I have many friends on both sides of the Green Line, in both communities, and beyond the 2 main communities as well. It's important to add, because I think that is often overlooked. And so for me, Cyprus is a very personal thing, and it isn't just, I don't feel that I'm somehow detached from it, that I'm just some academic who flies in and you know, occasionally, or not at the moment, and then sort of comes, you know, draws some conclusions, and you know, from speaking to a couple of people, no, I really do feel very much embedded. I lived on the island for many years, and as I say, I've got this 30-year attachment to it. And so obviously, you know, I'm looking very closely at the developments as we're seeing it at the moment. And Altuğ, I was about to say, I had this whole talk prepared, and you covered so many of the things that I wanted to say. So you'd sort of, you know, hit on that. So what I really wanted to do was just say a few words, really, and maybe open it up to questions. But as I mentioned as well, I'm very keen to hear how people in Turkey see the prospect of new talks. And the way that it's viewed from there, not just at an official level, but certainly, you know, also, you know, as I said, I've been working on Cyprus for 30 years now. I'm guessing that a fair proportion of you who are watching this are significantly younger than 30 years old. So you will have entirely grown up with Cyprus, whether in the forefront or the background of your experience of Turkey's interaction with the wider world. And I think one of the interesting things I've seen is the way that Cyprus is not nearly the same issue, at least viewed from outside, in Turkey today that it was when I first started working on the Cyprus issue, where Cyprus was really the #1 national issue, if you like, in Turkey. But you know, I've definitely got a sense that that is no longer the case. It's not to say that it's unimportant or it's not significant, but it certainly feels that, with so many other issues taking place in and around Turkey, that it's just not the same issue that it was. And I think there's a number of interesting reasons for that, that perhaps we can discuss later. But of course, the thing at the moment is, my optimism is tempered by the language that we're hearing concerning the parameters for any new talks. And there's no escaping the fact that, we are now hearing talk of a two-state solution, and that this is something that has been put on, well, hopefully from the perspective of the Turkish Cypriots, being put on the agenda. And I personally don't feel that this is the way forward for a number of reasons. And I certainly don't think that this is the moment to be doing that. So I do fundamentally believe that a bizonal bicommunal federation is possible in Cyprus. And I think on that point, I would be very keen to emphasize that, one of the problems that we've had is that people get fixated on terminology. And I see this in all sorts of cases that I study. And, I often, for example, talk about Kosovo. And one of the reasons that Kosovo, in many ways, hasn't got full international recognition is because it focused on the word independence rather than the concept. And I think things could have been done slightly differently if there was more of a focus on that concept. And I think it's the same in Cyprus. There's a focus on the word federation rather than the focus on the concept of trying to create a model for governance that essentially allows the two communities to live together within a reunited Cyprus, but essentially maintain a lot of autonomy over the areas that really matter to them. And this is essentially what we're talking about with a federal system. And of course, you're going to have differences. You mentioned that, there's the confederal model versus, the tighter federation. But again, I think applying labels is probably more problematic than anything, because it's really about saying, what do the two communities want and what can the two communities live with? And essentially, I think both communities today want to control their own affairs. And I think both communities are equally concerned that if they come together, that there's going to be elements of domination. Now, that might sound strange to listen, from the perspective of a Turkish Cypriot, but to a Greek Cypriot, there is genuinely a fear that through reunification, you're going to have a community which is significantly smaller than the Greek Cypriots. And I'll talk a little bit about, I realize now what I'm saying could be read in a particular controversial way, and it's not as controversial as it might sound. But to a Greek Cypriot, there is a real fear that they're going to create a system where a small minority will be able to control the effective workings of the state. And one of the things which comes out very strongly was a concern that in 1960, when Cyprus became independent, that the Turkish Cypriots never really acted in the interests of Cyprus. That everything they did, they had to put to Ankara and get Turkey's permission. And I think that there is still a very genuine concern amongst many Greek Cypriots that will remain the same today. That if there's reunification, that the Turkish Cypriots will still be looking to Ankara for their directions. And this is something that certainly worries Greek Cypriots. Meanwhile, of course, the Turkish Cypriots are worried about being swamped by the Greek Cypriots. That as 20%, let's just round out the figures, but say roughly 20% of the population versus the Greek Cypriots who represent 80% of the population, that numerically the Greek Cypriots are just so much stronger, and that this is necessarily going to affect their position. And I think that, one of the things I really wanted to emphasize in this talk is that, having worked on Cyprus for as long as I have, in many cases, the real problem is that the sides just are incapable of listening to each other and empathizing. And I know that that sounds very sort of, you know, some would say maybe wishy-washy, you know, and everything, but it's so important in a case like Cyprus to try and understand why and how the other community feels the way it does and what sort of steps can be taken. Now, in some cases, this might require hard actions, such as what sort of presidential system is there going to be? But in other cases, it's more about just listening and understanding and thinking, right, we can express ourselves in a particular way that won't be so confrontational, that the other side might then hear us. And I think, you know, for example, we see this in history. History is incredibly important. And I deliberately decided when I was going to give this talk that I wasn't going to go through the whole history of the Cyprus problem. I take it for granted that you all know it. But I think history, nevertheless, is incredibly important. But, you know, for example, one of the things that I've seen is the way that history is abused by both communities. So there's a very selective reading that both communities will have. And so, for example, it was long the case that for a Greek Cypriot, history began in 1974. There was nothing that happened before. That has changed. So I wrote my doctoral thesis on the events of 1963 and 64 and the formation of the UN peacekeeping force on the island. And when I started work on that, which would have been around 1994, it was quite controversial because there were many people who didn't, especially on, well, certainly on the Greek Cypriot side, who didn't want to talk about that. But today it's not nearly as controversial. It's not controversial at all. Many will acknowledge that the problem started before 1974. 1974 is obviously a key moment of trauma for the Greek Cypriots. But I think that most Greek Cypriots, in fact, will now accept that it just didn't come out of the blue. But that was exactly the story that was told when I first started to work on the Cyprus problem. One of the problems that we have, though, is that very often what will happen, and I see this with both communities, and not just also Cyprus, again, I see it very much in the Balkans, which is another area I work on, is that when one side starts to confront the truth of what they did and say, we did bad things, such as, what then happens is that the other side takes that and uses it against the side that's admitting that they did something wrong. And what that does is immediately close down discussion. Because if a Greek Cypriot says, we did something bad in 1964, and then the next day, this is all over the Turkish Cypriot press saying, see, this Greek Cypriot admits that they did something terrible. And, you know, the Greek Cypriots need to take all the responsibility for everything that's ever happened in Cyprus. That then gets back, and that person becomes a lot more cautious about saying anything in future because there's a chance they get called a traitor in their own community. And that closes down the ability of the two communities to really understand what they did to each other. And it's not a one-sided story by any means. And so I think that this is incredibly important to, you know, to really try to get to grips with how the other side sees the problem. And just this doesn't go on enough. That, you know, even now you don't have enough people really understanding you know, what took place. So for many Turkish Cypriots, of course, there's the trauma of the 1960s and the isolation they experienced in the enclaves. But I don't think many also realize the trauma that was caused to the Greek Cypriots in 74, when 160,000 Greek Cypriots were forced to leave their homes, you know, places that they'd grown up in, you know. So for them, this is obviously something that is going to be very traumatic, even, you know, so many years, coming up for 50 years later. And, you know, we've seen how the two communities are very good at also making sure that historical memory is passed down. And I think that's in many ways one of the more concerning elements that I think a lot of us who've looked at Cyprus are very worried about, is that, you know, I often hear people, very well-meaning people, sort of say to me, oh, it's all about the youth. If we leave it to the young, Cyprus will be solved. And no, it's the evidence suggests actually the problem is with every passing year, the possibility of reunification becomes even more difficult, that many young don't have any memory of shared experience together. And, you know, I point this out. So I was born in 1972. I didn't get involved in Cyprus until, you know, as I said, I was about 18. But I was born only 2 years before 1974, and I'm firmly into middle age now. And, you know, seeing as the two communities effectively became estranged in 1963-64, you would be essentially saying that anyone now, and, you know, right, say your first memory is maybe 7 or 8 years old. So we'd be talking anyone in their old, you know, anyone younger than mid-60s will have no real experience of having lived side by side in a unified Cyprus when it first became independent or prior to independence. So that historical memory is disappearing. And I think that this is a very, very worrying trend that's making reunification all the more difficult. Now, Altuğ, you mentioned about bizonal, bicommunal federation and the difference between the two. And I think that this is incredibly important because you're very right. We think that there's an agreement on what it means, but in reality, as I said, you know, the terminology is very different, and the understanding of that, you know, a tight federation versus a loose federation versus confederation, but it's even more fundamental than that. And I think that, you know, we talk about bizonal, bicommunal federation, and of course, there's a gulf of difference between the two communities on what this means. So for a Turkish Cypriot, the idea of a bizonal bicommunal federation means that there is one federal component state unit that will be exclusively Turkish Cypriot, and there will be a Greek Cypriot federal state unit, whatever you want to call it, that will be exclusively Greek Cypriot. Whereas, of course, to a Greek Cypriot, it means something slightly different. It means that there will be one unit that is likely to be predominantly Turkish Cypriot, but not exclusively so. And likewise, there will be another unit that will be predominantly Greek Cypriot, but not exclusively so. And I think many Greek Cypriots feel, and I think understandably, rather concerned with the idea that in reunification, the two communities will remain strictly apart, that there has got to be some mechanism that will allow the communities to be able to come together and interact more freely, that will allow Greek Cypriots to be able to go back to their villages or towns and exist, you know, with liberty to participate in decision-making at a municipal level and at a federal level, and also at the component level. But I also understand the concerns that the Turkish Cypriots have. And I think one of the things that, you know, I often find very frustrating is you will hear outsiders say, why can't they just all be Cypriots? I don't understand it. It would be so much easier if they were all just Cypriots. And I have a deep aversion to this idea that, you know, you should just simply have a wholly civic Cypriot identity. And I say that, you know, coming from Britain, where we have a term, British, which sort of encapsulates the various parts, but I just always sort of feel that, you know, Britain's great strength is that it is a mixture. We've got Scottish, we've got Welsh, Northern Irish, and I think that needs to also be reflected in other cases like Cyprus. It's not a case of saying, why can't they just all be Cypriot? No. While one would hope that there would be an allegiance to the Cypriot state and a sense of Cypriot identity, I understand why the Turkish Cypriots feel very worried that their identity, their distinct identity, will be watered down. That if they're all just Cypriots, then with Greek Cypriots representing 80% of the population, that they will be crammed out of the picture. And so, you know, I've always argued that any settlement has got to be fundamentally based on respecting the right of the Turkish Cypriots to have their identity recognized, to protect that identity. But again, it's got to be done in a way that isn't exclusionary, that doesn't try and completely write out Greek Cypriots, that somehow you want to have a coming together, but not in a way that's just going to completely eradicate the identity of any community. And I think this is also important because, again, we do forget that all the discussion is focused on Greek and Turkish Cypriots. But of course, we have Maronites, we have Latins, we have Armenians. And in actual fact now, I think you could say that there are wider communities. As you know, in any settlement, there will be a Turkish community of some sort in Cyprus. There will be a mainland Greek community of some sort. There is a British community. And in actual fact, as I often point out, there's more Brits per head of population living in Cyprus than there are Cypriots per head of population living in Britain. Not a lot of people know that. So, you know, that is something that I think it's important to have a wider understanding that allows different identities to exist, but doesn't try and eradicate them or force them to one side. Now, of course, we could get into all sorts of debate about, you know, the technicalities of, you know, governance structures. But I think overall, we're fairly clear, you know, what a united Cyprus would look like. Now, you know, many Greek Cypriots hate the thought of a reintroduction of the Annan Plan. And I think, you know, we have moved on, that the Annan Plan isn't the basis for a settlement now. But there are all sorts of elements within it, which I think we would all accept aren't going to change radically in any final settlement. So things have got to be updated. And remembering, of course, it is coming up now, quite unbelievably, for 17 years since the referendum in 2004. And I was living on the island at the time, and I remember the, you know, what went on very, very well. But there will need to be changes. But essentially, you know, we aren't talking about a massive divergence. So how a presidential council or a presidency will operate, yeah, that will be open to discussion. But essentially, we know that, you know, we're going to have a creation where you've got two essentially federal units. You're going to have a national government, a federal government. What are going to be the competences of that government are going to have to be decided. But you know, I think we know that it'll have to have competence over foreign affairs, that it's going to have competence over defense issues. Monetary policy is interesting because, of course, the expectation is that a reunited Cyprus will use the euro. So that will remove certain functions or alleviate decision-making in that regard. But at the same time, unlike the Annan Plan, we're also talking about a Cyprus that will be a member of the European Union, and it will need to come up with mechanisms to ensure that even if powers that come under EU competence devolved in Cyprus, that the two communities, the two federal states, will have to be able to work with each other to have a single voice when talking in Brussels. And this is going to be incredibly important, and that needs to be addressed. So there will be these things that have got to be looked into and built upon. But I don't think that we can argue that the sides are a million miles apart from each other on a lot of this. That if there was the goodwill, if there was that real sense of trying to understand where they're coming from, that I don't think that it would be so difficult to find a settlement. And I know people would say, well, you know, it's so complex. It isn't complex. You know, it was mentioned at the start. There's a saying for every circumstance in Cyprus. I've discovered that the graveyard of diplomats is definitely one of them. And you mentioned about Richard Holbrooke. I remember when Richard Holbrooke got involved in Cyprus, and he was so sure of himself. Oh, he'd solved Bosnia. He could do anything. And he came along to Cyprus. 3 months later, he took a job working in a bank in Wall Street. He was, it didn't last long. So the great Richard Holbrooke had given up on Cyprus because I think he felt that, but that's the thing, it's not actually that complicated. And I'm really reminded of the phrase, it's not the complexity of it all, it's the infinity of it all. It seems never ending. That's the problem in Cyprus. It's not about saying, right, we can't find solutions. I think, if you were to get together most Cyprus specialists who were saying, right, okay, let's work towards a settlement, we'd have very quickly, we'd have a broad idea of what that settlement would look like. So I don't think that is necessarily a problem. And even security, which is traditionally a very, very deep concern. I think that there has been significant movement in terms of understanding what a security arrangement for a reunited Cyprus would be. And I think primarily we're looking beyond the logic of armed force to protect security. That this is an approach that really belongs in a different era. That's not to say that, look, we won't have a peacekeeping force. I think it's highly likely, if not certain, that there will have to be some sort of peacekeeping mission continuing on the island in the event of a settlement. But ideas, for example, of guarantees, if I'm to be honest, and I know that this is a controversial subject, I think that there is a general consensus, certainly internationally, that this really, this isn't really appropriate for an independent country in the 21st century. And that there are all sorts of other ways, that the rights of the Turkish Cypriots can be protected. And I think, nobody who looks at Cyprus sort of feels that these can be ignored. Of course they can't, but, to resort to a logic from 60 years ago of having significant armed forces on the island, that's not to say, that all will leave. There could be room to have a continuing military presence of some sort. But, to frame a settlement in that basis, I think there is a sense that things have moved on significantly from that. And I think that even amongst Turkish Cypriots, there's an understanding that there's all sorts of other ways that these concerns can be addressed. So even this issue of guarantees and troops, I think, if there is the political will there and the goodwill there, can be overcome. So, I realize that the time, we will run short. So I'll sort of draw it to an end there and maybe open it up to questions and answers and sort of follow up on all of this. But essentially, I know that there is this talk of a two-state solution at the moment, and I understand in part where that's coming from, the frustration. But at the same time, and again, I realize that this is controversial ground. But I think that also what I'm hearing is a lot of people who are talking about a two-state solution saying, well, we've negotiated for 40 years and it's got us nowhere. And so now we're not going to talk about a bizonal bicommunal federation anymore. But let's take a step back and look at that 40 years. That for the vast majority of it, no, there wasn't meaningful negotiation on a bizonal bicommunal federation. It wasn't until Mehmet Ali Talat took over the presidency from Rauf Denktaş. And listen, I met Denktaş many times. I liked Denktaş enormously at a personal level. I always said I would never have wanted to be his political enemy. But I met him and he was actually a very funny person in real life. He was a larger than life character. I disagreed fundamentally with his politics, but he did not want a settlement. And he never showed any interest in seriously negotiating a bizonal bicommunal federation. So the idea that he might have signed up to it, but he led the Declaration of Independence in 1983, a huge mistake, if I'm to be very honest, for the Turkish Cypriots. And he never really engaged. And I remember many years ago, the lovely story that was printed in one of the newspapers here of a British Foreign Secretary saying to Denktaş, trying to get into Denktaş's mind and doing some reverse psychology, saying, Mr. Denktaş, what would you say when people will say that you were the person who stood in the way of a reunified Cyprus? And, he was obviously expecting Denktaş to say, no, that's not me. I'm not. It's all the Greek Cypriots. Denktaş just looked at him and said, I think that would be a fair assessment. That Denktaş never made, and David Hannay, who wrote a very interesting book from his experience, was very clear that Denktaş, and let's forget up until around 2003, that there were serious negotiation efforts. I think we saw it under Talat. We certainly saw it under Mustafa Akıncı. No doubt about it. But I think, this idea that there's been 40 years of talk in favor of a bizonal bicommunal federation, and that both sides have equally engaged on this is just not true. And I don't think the international community sees it in that way. And they will be listening to the people who are saying this now. So, Mr. Tatar saying this is not going to cut ice internationally. They're going to look and say, no, we know that it was Mr. Talat who negotiated for a bizonal bicommunal federation. We know that it was Mr. Akıncı that negotiated for a bizonal bicommunal federation. But we also know that Mr. Denktaş didn't, Mr. Eroglu didn't, and are you? So I think, there will be the view, certainly, that they're going to have to engage on talks on reunification on the basis of on a federal settlement. The idea that can just simply say, no, we've talked about this for so long, we're changing the parameters, I just don't think is realistic. So I think it's not just, I think that we can get a bizonal bicommunal federation. I think that there is still the very clear international intention to see this happen. And that, writing off attempts to try and do that and say we're going to try and pursue recognition and things I just don't think is going to work. So my optimism isn't just based on the fact that I think a settlement on that basis can still work. I think that there's really no choice, at least for the meanwhile, to continue to focus on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to open my microphone. Yes, thank you, James. It was quite informative. And now, if you like, we can pass to the questions and answers period, like you already wanted to. We have many questions, and our audience can continue to write their questions on the chat segment. And if you like to ask your questions by person using your microphones, please let me know so that I can leave you the ground. So I will start from Samet, who would like to ask by person. So Samet, our student from the IR department, you can use your microphone and webcam if you like to.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Mr. Günal. Hello, Mr. Lindsay. Thank you so much for this giving conference. It was really huge, kind of a fruitful conference. My question will be the Cyprus question as to Turkish foreign policy and Cyprus foreign policy. So, as we noted, the 10 December European Union Council summit results, Angela Merkel gave a speech that they will coordinate with the United States of America. I mean, can you say the concrete steps will be taken in the future in the Cyprus question concerning the Cyprus question will be based on both the Turkish side and the Cyprus side, and also United States of America in the place. So can we say the concrete steps will be taken in the future? Thank you so much.
How would you like to handle it? Individual questions or take a few at a time?
Okay.
No, I mean, I'm happy to go with whichever you prefer.
However you like to.
Okay.
The questions are quite different from each other, so you can answer one by one.
Okay, all right. Look, so thank you very much. I think there's definitely a strong desire to try and have another go at Cyprus, and the role of the United States will be very interesting. And I think you know, essentially, there's always the complication that you get when you're trying to deal with Cyprus as to who should be involved. And that the more you bring in, the more complex it gets. And, you know, my sense is that, yes, the United States has an important role to play. And of course, Jane Hall-Lutu is leading the UN effort at the moment, is a senior US figure. So, you know, the United States, but, you know, in recent years, we've actually not seen a lot of direct involvement by the United States in trying to reach a settlement. The United States has actually been incredibly active in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it hasn't really focused on Cyprus settlement efforts. And so I think it will be interesting to see what happens now with the Biden administration. I think one of the things that obviously becomes a concern is that, again, if you bring in too many actors, I think it can complicate matters, but also there's always the danger that if you make it too strong that the United States is involved, then are you creating the conditions for Russia to get involved as well? And I think there's a certain amount of caution about that. And I think it was quite telling that in the case of Crans-Montana, the United States and I was about to call it the Soviet Union, gosh. The United States and Russia were actually absent altogether. Now, you know, whether one would say, well, that was for the good, and, you know, or whether one would say, and that's precisely why we didn't get a settlement, you know, obviously opinion is going to be varied on this. But I think it will be interesting to see what happens. But I think so much of this is also about key stakeholders, to use that word, working with each other and really actually playing to their strengths to help get a settlement. And, you know, different actors have influence with different parties. And I think it's important, you know, and I've always argued that the international community needs to work with each other to try and get a Cyprus settlement. That the UK needs to work with the UN needs to work with the European Union, that Britain needs to work with Turkey and Greece as the guarantors, you know, and that everyone needs to work with the two communities. So I guess this is a long way of saying that I have my concerns, but I also see how valuable it is to try and make sure that, you know, all interested parties are working with each other towards a common goal.
Thank you. Greetings to the London School of Economics from Turkey.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Samet. And Çalkan Vatansever thanks you, first of all, and then says, along with the Cyprus problem, I wonder your thoughts about the current political and military tension between Greece and Turkey, and the issue of Eastern Mediterranean gas areas. According to your views, do you have similar optimistic prospects concerning a common solution on the allocation of potential natural gas areas, he asks. So, and what can EU do?
Okay. Now, look, I actually, although I've worked on Cyprus for so long, I've also worked on bilateral Greek-Turkish relations. And as we know, they're very different from each other. There's a lot of overlap, but they're essentially based on two very, very different issues. And of course, what we're dealing with in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Aegean are questions of international law, and an arrangement that was reached under the Treaty of Lausanne, which made sense according to international law that existed a century ago. But of course, there's been very significant developments in international law over the past 100 years, which raises sort of questions about how these issues are now dealt with. And of course, there's a fundamental difference between Greece and Turkey on what issues are open. So Greece says, well, we're willing to debate and acknowledge that there's an issue to do with the continental shelf, but we don't accept that there's an issue to do with territorial waters, for example. And I think what's been very interesting is this whole question of natural gas and how this has complicated the situation so much more. So, for example, we would know that there were issues in the Aegean, but the debates now over the Eastern Mediterranean are relatively new. And it didn't really matter in the past. Nobody really cared. But the fact that there could be, you know, there's gas under that water has suddenly made it so much more complicated and very worrying. And All I can say is that, you know, I personally think that, you know, although the talks are going on at the moment, that, you know, the most obvious settlement option would be to take the matter to the International Court of Justice. I think that, you know, Greece is obviously in a very strong legal position. There's no doubt about it. And that's why Turkey is obviously very worried about this. But I think that the court has also proven time and time again that it can be extremely pragmatic. And I think, you know, you know, it's obviously Greece feels very strongly, but around Castellorizo, I think that there are a lot of people who feel that, look, you know, the fact that Greece would have such territorial claims on the Eastern Mediterranean because of Castellorizo does seem to be, you know, unusual. Let's put it, let's just use a diplomatic term. But at the same time, I think that, you know, Greece feels that very often Turkey is resorting to threats of military force to try and get the upper hand in these debates. And that, you know, it feels very vulnerable in that way. So I think, you know, it really is a question of, you know, how the two countries can sit down and talk rationally about this, and, you know, whether there is some sort of acknowledgement. And I understand where Turkey's coming from about the Aegean turning into a Greek lake if Greece extends its waters to 12 nautical miles. But there are ways of overcoming that. And also, it's not actually quite as significant as many people might realize, that it doesn't have a major impact on the things, on Turkish shipping. But nevertheless, this is all part and parcel, I think, of a bigger problem. And, you know, I believe that, you know, hopefully if we can settle Cyprus, that might then also mean that we'll be able to settle those outstanding issues between Greece and Turkey elsewhere. But I've long felt, and I got in terrible trouble once for saying it, but I have long felt that Cyprus does poison Greek-Turkish relations. And that it makes it so much more difficult for the two countries to reach a settlement to, you know, any bilateral differences they have.
Okay, thank you. Yasemin Akman would like to ask verbally.
Hello.
So, you have the ground.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for hosting this very fruitful meeting. And hello, James Ker-Lindsay. I had the privilege of reading your book and reviewing it about the Cyprus problem. I'm a PhD student in Eastern Mediterranean University. Well, I'm very much interested in this issue. I have actually two questions. The one is about the rising nationalism. Well, until Mr. Ersin Tatar's period, we see somehow policies more independent in Northern Cyprus. I mean, despite to Ankara's policies, despite to Turkey's policies, yet Tatar's approach is very much a nationalist point of view and very much hand in hand with Ankara. So considering the failure of Crans-Montana meeting, now we are having an upcoming meeting, Big Five meeting, that will be on lately by April, I guess. And how UK sees this nationalist point of view. I mean, how UK sees Turkey's policies as a guarantor state. And there is, I would love to be as optimistic as you are, but there is a hard dispute in Northern Cyprus, since Northern Cyprus lost itself to be a political subject. So how UK sees this? And my second question is rather different from this Big Five meeting. As you know, there is a rapprochement between Turkey and Russia and Azerbaijan and Turkey, a strong rapprochement. And 1 month ago, 1 and 2 months ago, there was a declaration from Azerbaijan saying that we might recognize Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So do you foresee this kind of attempt in the near future? And thank you so much.
Two great questions, Yasmin, and thank you very, very much. do I want to read your review of my book on Cyprus, or is it best that I don't? It's, you know, I think, you know, the relationship between Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots is incredibly interesting. And I think that there's a tendency amongst many Greek Cypriots to read it in very narrow ways, that it's always been about Turkey dictating to the Turkish Cypriots what should happen. And it's much more complex than that. And again, I remember very, very clearly the Denktaş era. And a lot of Turkish politicians were rightly very, very frightened of Mr. Denktaş. That if they said something he didn't like, the next thing is he'd be on a plane, or I wonder if he'd be doing Zoom if he was around today, speaking to a university audience, saying how terrible it was that the Turkish Cypriots were being sold out by whoever it was, Mrs. Chile, Mr. Yilmaz, probably less so sort of Mr. Ecevit or Mr. Demirel, but you know, these were the figures, and I see Altuğ smiling a little bit. You know, I realize, unfortunately, this was the Turkish politics that I was studying when I was a PhD student. These were the huge figures, and it was an era of lots of big figures, big names, if you like. Turgut Özal, for example. Whereas today you haven't got that in Cyprus, and there is, I think, a sense that the Turkish Cypriot leadership, especially the current one, is much more pliable to what Turkey wants. But that also represents an opportunity, I think. You know, and I'm not speaking for, you know, I'm speaking very much from a personal perspective on this. This is not sort of representing London or anything like that. That there is a sense that maybe this does open up opportunities. And that's why I said I would be really interested to hear how Turkey sees the situation at the moment. Because if Mr. Tata is so linked in with the Turkish government and is so tied into what their views are, then it means that if they can, you know, have decided in favor of a settlement for whatever reason, I know the language at the moment doesn't look that way, then hopefully it becomes a little bit more easy for them to deliver what the Turkish government wants. So that's an optimistic view on it. I think it becomes a little bit more complicated in terms of how negotiations play out. That makes it more complicated. But I think I'm not necessarily inclined to believe that this is necessarily a bad thing. I can see how it can work. It doesn't make things easy, and it's certainly not helpful, I think, to be talking two-state solution at the moment. But I think there is also a sense that this is more a negotiating tactic, that it will become very clear that there isn't going to be a discussion on a two-state solution. And the best that can be got is that if you engage positively and these talks fail, then maybe we can start to consider another option. But we're not going to move to another option yet. On Azerbaijan, I find this fascinating because, of course, this is nothing new. There's been talk of Azerbaijan recognizing the TRNC for a very long time, but it's never happened. Now, of course, that was because of Nagorno-Karabakh, and you know, people would say, and now Nagorno-Karabakh is solved, then Azerbaijan's not going to do this. I'd be very surprised if it did. I'm not willing to say that it won't, but I do think it would be extremely unhelpful if Azerbaijan did that, and there would be very strong international criticism, you know, of its position on this. But there is every possibility that it may feel that it owes Turkey something. And if Ankara says, look, we need to make the point that the TRNC can be recognized by another country, you need to do this for us. One wonders, you know, if you know, the government in Baku might be willing to do that. So I think that it would be unlikely, and all logic would say that it's unlikely, but I can't discount it.
Thank you.
Okay, there are tens of questions. It's coming like rain, but we proposed 30 minutes in total for the questions and answers period. So I will ask you to be a little bit quick by asking your questions. So it's now the turn for Kerem Çetiner, who also likes to ask by microphone. Okay.
Hello, Kerem Çetiner from Ege University, Department of International Relations. Firstly, thank you for joining us today. And secondly, as fastly as I can with my question, when we identify the people of Cyprus, we use the identification of Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. And the important word is being Turkish or Greek. As we can see there, the Cyprus can't develop or not much try to develop a common identity. I'm asking a question that what's your thoughts about the identity problem, about the importance of identity problem over Cyprus and the solution process, and how can we develop a common identity over the Cypriots? Thank you very much.
Okay, I lost you briefly. I don't know whether it was the connection at my end, but if I heard you right, it was about sort of forming this sense of a Cypriot identity. Look, I mean, as I said, I'm a great believer that, you know, there needs to be a recognition of Greek and Turkish Cypriotness. I think that this is very important for all sorts of reasons. But I also understand, and I emphasize the point that there needs to be a loyalty amongst Cypriots towards Cyprus. And it's not an easy balancing act to find. There's no doubt about it. But I do genuinely believe that, you know, and I understand why Turkish Cypriots feel worried and feel that they need to protect that identity. And I think every step needs to be done to ensure that. But I think you can find commonality, that you can find ways that they would look to each other and say, well, yes, you know, we speak Turkish and Greek, and you know, we have a natural affinity to you know, to Greece and Turkey separately, but at the same time, Cyprus is our common home. Now, I know it sounds very sort of, you know, dream and the rest of it, but I definitely think that it's possible, and we see it in many occasions. That coming together and understanding a common identity. And you find it abroad, that Greek and Turkish Cypriots, when they meet, I know it's not cliche, but it is often so true, that, you know, they're able to interact, and, you know, it's a shared homeland.
Okay, thank you. And now Osman, I can't read his last name. Osman Bey says, thinks the same way you do. As a Cypriot, I don't think the Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots negotiated federation 40 years. Federation had been only negotiated for 4 years between Talat Christofias and Akıncı Anastasiadis, like you said. As a matter of fact, bizonal and bicommunal federation was never really negotiated, but by other leaders such as Denktaş, who was known as Mr. No for his uncompromising stance against any solution. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, Osman, thank you very much. Absolutely, I'm on the same page. So I think we need to think of negotiations in that way. And I think, if anything, this means that Mr. Tata has got to prove himself. And they're not good. I think the international perspective is, you don't get to get your wishes on the back of those leaders who negotiated in good faith. You can't come in as a hardliner and expect to get, you know, talk about a two-state solution because you say, oh, our efforts to get a bizonal bicombination failed under people who negotiated that in good faith. So I think that's incredibly important points. And I think that's a point that will be being made not only to the Turkish Cypriot leadership, but also to Turkey, that, you know, it's the hard work of others which have you know, got the Turkish Cypriots goodwill, if you like, internationally. But this government is now going to have to prove, this administration is going to have to prove that it too can negotiate in good faith.
Okay, Tolunay Öndül wants to ask a verbal question, a quick one, I hope.
Yes, so thank you very much for the talk. It's always nice to have British on a topic related to diplomacy in the room. So the EU acts as a staunch supporter of the Greek Cypriots and even connecting the Cyprus issue to the broader Turkey-EU relations, which dates back to even before the Republic of Cyprus existed. So my question is, what do you think that the EU should do differently to play a constructive role rather than alienating the Turkish Cypriots by pressuring Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus? Thank you.
Look, I think it's a complex situation because, of course, Greece and Cyprus are members of the European Union, so they have a voice around the table. There's no doubt about it. But I think the European Union also feels deeply frustrated by the Cyprus problem. I think that they feel very concerned by what's taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so I think behind closed doors, you will find that there's probably a lot more pressure on the Greek Cypriots than appear publicly. So the EU does not like to criticize its members. There's a certain amount of solidarity at a public level, but I think definitely behind the scenes, there will be a lot more going on to say to the Greek Cypriots, look, you need to deliver a settlement, that we need to have good relations with Turkey. We need to have a peaceful Eastern Mediterranean, that this issue is just a legacy issue that needs to be resolved. And so I'm actually a lot more positive, and I think the European Union is actually a more impartial actor than people often give it credit for.
Okay, and Buse, who studies Cyprus in her thesis, would like to ask a question. She says, which kind of solution would provide the highest mutual benefit and maximize the interest of both sides, especially in terms of structure of government, territorial aspect, and the security of island? And do you believe that the UN could do more to bring the two communities closer to a solution? So basically she asks, what is your solution?
Yes, I was thinking that one. Do you know what? Look, I've never hidden the fact that I think that a loose federation is the way to go. And I sort of alluded to it in my, I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense for both communities. The fear that the Greek Cypriots have is that they think that if you have a loose federation, as soon as anything can go wrong, or that the Turkish Cypriots will walk out, and that they read the word loose to mean that it's very easy to break apart and for the Turkish Cypriots to then claim independence. And that's not what a loose federation means. What it means is that you minimize the points of friction in central government. Now, one thing I've learned over the years is that politicians behave like politicians, and they will argue, they will find difference. You want to minimize, so I often say you want to minimize the points of political contact between the community and maximize the points of economic contact. That is really the ideal solution that allows free movement of goods across the island, that allows Turkish Cypriots to go and work in the Greek Cypriot constituent state, Greek Cypriots to go and work in the north or the Turkish Cypriot constituent state, for businesses to invest on both sides of the line. So if you've got a Turkish Cypriot that wants to invest in a Greek Cypriot run business, that's great. These sort of things, but minimize the points of contact. I think we know what the territorial distribution will be, that we've really settled on around 28%, from 28 to 29%. And personally speaking, I don't believe in guarantees. I don't think that it's the way that we should be looking at it. But I do absolutely believe that there's a whole range of other mechanisms that can be introduced that would protect the Turkish Cypriots. So essentially, I don't think that's a million miles off from what we'd be talking about. I might be at the more loose end of the federal model, but I don't think that stands apart from many other observers who've spent a lot of time looking at Cyprus and believe that reunification is possible.
Okay, Aslan Karataş, who is also a master's student, will ask her question verbally.
Hello. Firstly, I want to thank you for your participation, Mr. Lindsay. It has now been almost 50 years since the island was divided, and almost 60 years since the two communities actually lived alongside one another. As someone who spent many years living in Cyprus, I wonder your personal opinion about the future of the island. Do you think it seems probable that the parties could reach a consensus? And do you think that the political will is there? Thank you for your answers.
Also, thank you very much. You know, again, it's all about political will. That they could wrap this up if they were willing to show goodwill to each other, and you know, because then you can be a bit more flexible on some of the details. But when you don't trust the person at the other side of the table, then every small detail becomes a major point, because you're constantly thinking, what if this goes wrong, or what if that goes wrong? And I understand that you need to have a certain amount of caution when you're dealing with this, to make sure that, you know, you try and anticipate all eventualities and prevent it from happening. But I think that this crosses a boundary into just argumentation over small details that, frankly, if you had leaders who were really willing to look at the positive of each other and try and understand where each other's concerns really lie and the community's concerns, I think you could address so much of this easily. So again, it's optimism. Maybe it's naive optimism, but I definitely can see a settlement. But whether we'll get there, again, it just really comes down to, you know, have you got leaders who have that vision for why Cyprus needs to be reunited and are willing to trust the other community to actually behave, you know, and say, you know what, thinking about it, it's very much a reflection, I wonder, of within their communities. You know, if they're saying, well, we're the ones who are the good guys, we're going to behave well, it's the other side. Well, stop for a moment and say, well, you know, why wouldn't they want to behave well? Why wouldn't they want to make it work as well? So again, look, naive optimism maybe, but I do genuinely believe that a settlement is, you know, we know what a settlement essentially looks like. Apart from things of how many senators you might have, or, you know, how many ministers you'll have, and you know, we know what broadly it looks like.
Thank you. I will take the last three questions. Serap Yalçınkaya from our university asks, which attempt was the closest to a solution until now? She asks.
Good question. Annan plan. Simply because there was a plan on the table, and it was a plan that many observers felt was feasible. But of course, it failed. And I guess you could say a failure is a failure. You know, do you have degrees of failure with this? So I remember very closely watching the Annan plan, and even though I felt that it was a good basis for a settlement, it was very obvious living on the island at the time that it wasn't going to pass, that there was just too much opposition to it. And in actual fact, I mean, lots of lessons were learned that will need to be remembered or revisited if there is another attempt at a settlement. And that includes that the opponents of a settlement start negotiating, opposing it from day one. Whereas what we saw with the Annan plan is that the supporters waited until the plan had been revealed before deciding. They said, no, we have to see the plan and then we'll argue in favor. And they only had 3 weeks to argue, whereas the opponents said, we don't care about what's in the plan. You know, we're not interested. We don't want a settlement. And frankly, whatever plan is delivered, it's not going to be what we want. So we'll just argue against it. And so there was 18 months of that propaganda well before the referendum. And I think that's incredibly important to bear in mind, that if a talks process starts now, even though we might not have the plan on the table, I really think that efforts need to be made to make the case for reunification, and to say reunification matters and we're going to get a good deal and it's actually going to be really beneficial. So I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you. Tuğçe Samsun, who studied 1974 Greek military coup in Cyprus before, wants to ask her question verbally.
Hello. Thank you for joining us in this meeting, and I feel privileged like anyone else in here Actually, my questions has already been asked, but I would like to learn your opinion about the two-state solution, because our president's spokesman, Ibrahim Kalın, stated that we cannot discuss this federal solution for another 40 years. And what is your opinion about that? Thank you in advance.
Thank you very, very much. I know maybe it's completely undiplomatic of me and I can't resist it, but your surname, when I heard it and talked of 1974, yeah, I'm guessing I'm not the first person who brought this up.
I know, it's hilarious. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it, but there's a certain irony there.
Totally.
Yes, look, I understand absolutely where the feeling is that this has been, but I've made the point that it's no point saying that we've negotiated bizonal bicommunal federation for 40 years. We can't do it for another, because it hasn't been negotiated for 40 years. That's the whole point. And for a large, and I accept that the Greek Cypriots rejected the Annan Plan in 2004, but let's also not forget that essentially we had decades where Mr. Denktaş wasn't negotiating. And having said that, I think that there is a real feeling that this can't continue forever, that something will need to be done at some point. But I really, you know, I always say, look, George Vasiliou, the former president of Cyprus, he tells the story that when Cyprus wanted to join the European Union, there was a lot of opposition in the European Union to Cyprus joining because of its division. And he obviously had the support of Greece, but he realized that Britain would be another important supporter. So he went to Mrs. Thatcher and said, look, Cyprus wants to apply to join the European Union. Will you support us? And apparently she said to him, look, give it one more go. Go back to the table. If you do it, and you really show that you're committed to a settlement, and I believe that former President Vasiliou was definitely committed to a settlement. You know, he was, I a lot of admiration for him. If you go back and you can prove that you've negotiated in good faith and the talks fail again, then we will support you. And that's exactly what he did. And I almost get the feeling that we're getting close to that position, that, all right, fine. This is not the time to be talking about two states. I really don't believe that, but I also understand why there is a frustration. And, you know, bearing in mind that the Turkish Cypriot side was responsible for failure for a long time, and that the Greek Cypriots have also borne their responsibility, let's at least give it one more go. And we can then evaluate where responsibility lies and maybe rethink, and then start to think about what other alternatives might be. And I'm not going to go down the route of saying what those alternatives could be. And I'm not going to go down the route of saying it's just going to be, you know, in favor of the Turkish Cypriots, because there's every chance that the Turkish Cypriots, you know, might bring these talks down, in which case I'd be in favor of tougher measures against the Turkish Cypriots. But I think we can go into these talks and say, everyone needs to give this one more go, and then let's see where we stand at the end of it. But I really think that we need to focus at least one more time on a really big push towards a bizonal bicommunal federation.
I actually see that as a resentment of Turkey towards EU, because Turkey now follows the Sinatra doctrine like EU did in this China situation, actually.
I'm not sure I sort of followed exactly sort of what you were saying on that.
Turkey chose to follow its own way with regards to Cyprus issue, because we already know that Turkey was not seen as a candidate status in European Union as a matter of foreign relations issue along with China and Russia.
No, I look, and I understand that there's a lot of resentment in Turkey towards this, but, you know, at the same time, there are so many other issues, and, you know, this is for a whole other session that Turkey has got to deal with. And I think that there is a willingness and, you know, I've seen that as well, for Turkey to reach a settlement on Cyprus. I think there's a lot of people in Turkey and in the Turkish government who see the benefits of doing a deal and getting a Cyprus settlement. And, you know, I saw that in 2016, 2017. So, you know, I think that that's still there. And I think a lot of what we're hearing at the moment is posturing. And we're going to have a lot of this from both sides in the coming months. But ultimately, I do still think that the message will be going out to Ankara, to Athens, to both sides of the line in Nicosia. You've got to come back to the table and give this one more big go. And then if that fails, then maybe let's then consider what happens. But I mean, I understand where Mr. Kalin is coming from and saying we can't do this for another 40 years. But, you know, let's also remember that you know, that 40 years wasn't all just one side's fault.
Thank you. I actually admire your good faith in this situation. Thank you again.
Okay, last two questions. İpek Değirmencioğlu would like to ask verbally.
Hello. Firstly, I'm thankful to conference and all the information that you gave. Firstly, you mentioned about both sides should listen and understand each other in sensitive issues such as Cyprus. How can we integrate empathy and diplomacy together? It's territorial and historical political subject, and both sides tend to behave aggressively in this case. Can we see this kind of adaptation in forthcoming negotiations? And I'm wondering your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, that's a fantastic question. And do you know what? I wrote a paper. You can find it. It's on the Prio-Cyprus Center on establishing a culture of engagement. And this is what's really been missing. That for too long, the international community has focused on the settlement talks. And in fact, what we've seen in the past couple of years, which I think has been incredibly positive, but it hasn't delivered the results yet, is to say to the sides, look, you're too good at saying it's the other side's fault, they don't want to talk. We're not interested in that word and that blame game anymore. What we want to see are real actions that show that you're committed to a settlement, that the real steps that you're taking to engage with the other community. Where are the steps being taken to put money into bicommunal activities? Where are the ministers speaking out and the leaders speaking out in favor of a settlement? Where are those political figures when a newspaper writes a horrible column saying you can't trust the Greek Cypriots, or you can't, all the Turkish Cypriots are, you know, you know, we've got to drive them away. Where are the senior political figures coming out and condemning these things? You know, what are they doing to try and encourage Greek and Turkish Cypriot businesses to cooperate with each other? You know, putting money into artistic efforts. You know, these are the things which have really been missing for far too long. And I absolutely believe, you know, I passionately believe that more needs to be done. And I'm really pleased that the UN has now taken this on board. So if you look at UN resolutions in the past couple of years and Secretary General reports, they're really emphasizing this now, that it's actually saying enough with the talk. We know that you're very good at talking and persuading us that the other side is the problem. This is how you prove that you are actually committed, because we can see how much money has been spent. We can look at all, you know, they can present, look at this time when Mr. Anastasiades condemned somebody for writing something bad, or Mr. Tatar did it. That's what we really need to see. So I completely agree, more focus on this.
Okay, and our last question comes from Dilek Karabajak. The demographies of the communities on both sides on the island have changed. They are getting younger. It is possible that the younger the communities get, the more pressure within the communities towards the solution occur. Or do you think that the more populist ideas gain more ground with the younger communities, as in many parts of the world, and thus more difficult to find a common ground, she asks.
I completely agree. That I think that there is a complacency that people say, oh, it's all in the hands of the young. We get rid of these old time politicians, and the young have no experience of living together. And I remember a really quite important experience I had many years ago when there was a talk at the LSEE on Cyprus, and a Greek Cypriot student came up to me afterwards, and I can't remember exactly what started it, but I was talking about a federal model, and this student was getting more and more upset. And I thought, oh, you know, it's sort of unitary settlement and everything like that. And at some point, just said to me, I think we should be separate from each other. We've got nothing in common. We haven't, you know. So there I was, sort of thinking, oh, I'm going to have to tread carefully because this is somebody who wants a unitary state and is getting upset when I'm talking federation. No, this was somebody getting, and it was a key moment because I've heard that many times since. And that was my first encounter with young Greek Cypriots who were saying, maybe we should just be separate. And I don't think that this is the way forward for Cyprus, that for either community, because I don't see a divided Cyprus. Now, look, a lot of people think if they could agree on separation, then the North could join the European Union separately. And that might solve the issue because they'd come together. I'm very skeptical that that will be the case. And I'm getting more skeptical because I think countries like France will say, if they divide and Northern Cyprus becomes independent, it will simply be absolutely guaranteed a Turkish proxy vote in the European Union. We will keep it out. So in actual fact, the idea of a two-state solution potentially being an option for the Turkish Cypriots, I don't think so. I think it will drive them further away from the European Union. And look, you know, I know that I'm speaking to a Turkish audience, and so now we're rather in the same boat here in Britain. We're outside of the European Union, and I think it's a great shame for both of our countries. I think it would be tragic for the Turkish Cypriots to find themselves pushed further away, and I think unification is their best option for their own long-term survival. I don't see a two-state solution emerging, and I don't see a two-state solution which would see Northern Cyprus incorporated into the European Union. I'm becoming more and more convinced of that. So I just don't think that becomes the route to take. So yes, I'm very concerned about young attitudes. And I think on a final note, I'll just say, you know, people would often say to me, in 2004, you know, they looked into who was the most likely to vote in favor of the Annan Plan on the Greek Cypriot side. And people would imagine that it would be young people. No, in actual fact, I tell this story time and time again, the most likely voter in 2004, Greek Cypriot, was male, over 55, with secondary school education, high school education. Essentially, the old guy who said, you know what, I've had enough of it. I just want to go back to my village. The most likely to vote against the Annan Plan was female, urban, young, university educated. The ones who would simply say, this is about human rights. This Annan Plan doesn't respect our human rights. We must reject it. Really, no experience of living, no village to want to go back to, it became a matter of principle for rejecting the plan. And I think that that's the danger, that you've got people who would just stick to principle because they don't see, they're not invested in reunification at a personal level like the older people had. And the young who are indifferent, who just simply say, we've never lived with the Turkish Cypriot, it's too big a risk. So I do really, really worry about this. And I think this is a huge problem.
Okay, we have more questions indeed, but I have to cut here. If not, we will have to keep Professor Lindsay until night here. So apologies to our audience and thank you for your great interest. But before ending, as you mentioned David Hannay in your speech, I remembered my interview with him. I had the chance to meet with him for several times in London. And what he said to me was, it is also written in his book, no one would ever lose money betting against the Cyprus solution, he said. I think even he had a role in Annan Plan. He believes it cannot be solved as well. And let me make another quote from Henry Kissinger. He said, two problems in the world I'd never wanted to become involved in were the Cyprus problem and Northern Ireland. but he had to be directly involved in 1974 and afterwards.
And
let me.
Northern Ireland was solved, though.
Yeah,
but we know what the blueprint for a settlement looks like.
Yeah. And let me quote from you as well. You said, I mean, you wrote in your book, Cyprus issue is essentially a problem of 30,000 Turkish troops faced off against 30,000 Greek Cypriot lawyers. I always quote from you. What do you mean?
I can't take credit though.
Yeah, I know.
First to publish it, but I didn't. Yeah, but lawfare versus warfare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So the Cyprus issue is the United Nations probably most complex and the longest challenge after Palestine and Kashmir issues, probably. However, the parties concerned are looking at the Cyprus problem from completely different angle and seeing completely different things. Moreover, there is not a single problem in Cyprus. There are many intertwined and connected problems. To be fair, starting from 1950s, it is not possible to claim that Turkey had a single policy on Cyprus. Over time, it has swung from indifference to partition, for instance, federation to confederation, national cause to national burden sometimes. And no solution is a solution to being always one step ahead in the search for a solution. However, it is also clear that Turkey proved that she is doing her best to solve the problem by supporting the Annan plan, despite its risks, and Turkey gained the moral superiority, I believe. Furthermore, Turkish party was not awarded for her good intention. Instead, Greek party was awarded with EU membership. So Turkish party's new insistence on two-state formula is not without reason, I believe. In the early 2000s, Turkey was very keen on EU membership. As the Greek Cypriots guaranteed EU membership before the Annan Plan referenda, they thought they could get more from the Turkish side using the veto card for EU membership, I believe. However, for a couple of reasons, EU is not now a priority for Turkey. So things did not go the way Greek Cypriots hoped or wanted. So from one perspective, if the Turkish side stands firmly behind this two-state solution, it may cause the Greeks to approach even more positively to the loose federation formula they previously rejected. In other words, while the Greeks hope for a unitary-like state, they may be more willing for loose federal solution, worrying about losing even the chance for a tight federation with that two-state formula. As a matter of fact, time works against the Greek side, I believe. Turkey is getting more and more institutionalized in TRNC in time. And in fact, Turkey is establishing military bases on the island, just like British did. Therefore, thinking that waiting longer would make the solution Greeks dreamed impossible, Greek Cypriots may feel it's better if they accept a loose federation solution before it's too late. However, from another perspective, Greeks may think that they don't need to hurry. They have the advantage. Instead, they may choose to wait for a more accurate time, for right time. Some Greeks believe Turkey is getting more and more isolated and alone internationally. Recently, Qatar is normalizing its relations with the Gulf countries. Joe Biden, who doesn't look very friendly to Turkey, is elected as US president. So Turkey soon will remain more isolated and therefore will want to turn to EU for membership again, they hope. And Cyprus can use the membership advantage better at that time, they think. After Biden's election, I started to read more of these arguments on the Greek Cypriot media. However, at the end of the day, unless there is an unpredictable global development, such as the pandemic that emerged at the end of the 2019, for instance, it does not seem possible to find a solution that can satisfy both sides in the short or medium term, I believe, with morally smooth or legally flawless answers. That's what I think, actually. And dear James, I know how active and busy you are, but despite that, you accepted this webinar. Therefore, we are very much grateful that you are here. and it was certainly very fruitful and very informative. There was a great interest. We have a 100 people limit for the Zoom application, and it is fully blown. Everybody is here, everybody is interested, and we wish very much to host you here in Izmir after this pandemic ends. Last time you came, we had a chance to have a breakfast, but this time we will have a fish by the sea in Alsancak all together with our students as well, I hope. By the way, I suggest our students to subscribe to Professor Lindsay's YouTube channel. You will find many useful concepts and information there on IR. Actually, I'm following as well, so I suggest you to do the same. And dear İpek, our IR Student Club's Vice President, would like to thank you very shortly, and then we will end.
Yes, we are thankful to our guest, Professor James Ker-Lindsay, for the conference. This was an honor for us. Thank you for your sparing your precious time. For us, it was very useful to discuss Cyprus issue in this period when the informal negotiations are starting soon. And once again, I want to say thank you to Mr. Ker-Lindsay, or our dear Professor Altuğ Günal, and our valuable participants. We had a great conference. See you at our next one. And lastly, can we take a picture together?
Yes, let's have a souvenir photo together. So you can open your webcams if you like to be in the picture. Okay, if you are ready, I will take the screenshots.
I am taking screenshot.
Okay, you are also taking. Once more. Okay. So James, thank you very much. It was great to see you here. And as I already said, we really want to see you in Izmir. Possibly next year, who knows? Maybe we can overcome this pandemic and we can host you here.
Thank you, and really thank you as well to everyone for coming along today. And no, it was, I wish we could have spoken about Cyprus all day. That's the problem.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, I would also like to thank our student community for organizing this event. Enes and İpek is here, and all the community members are here as well. And I would like to thank our audience. It's like the conference salon is full, you can believe. And hope to see you in another event. I would ask you to take care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Yes. Duyuyor musun?
Duyuyorum.
Kaydı bitirdin değil mi?
Ne?
Kaydı bitirdin değil mi?
Yok mi?